I need the ambulance and the police. There's been a murder. My two friends are lying dead outside.
Okay.
In September 2003, Singaporean Ram Tiwary, then a student studying in Sydney, made this emergency call. He had found his two housemates dead in the living room. They were brutally bashed up. 8 months after the murder, Ram Tiwary was arrested, sentenced to life in prison for the murder of his two Singapore housemates. But Ram insisted he was innocent. He appealed twice, failed, until quite unexpectedly.
In July this year, Singaporean Ram Puneet Tiwary walked out of this maximum security prison a free man after being acquitted of double homicide. He had just spent the last 8 years in jail for a crime he till now insists he didn't commit.
How did the earlier emergency phone call help in Ram's acquittal? With exclusive crime scene pictures, we pieced together the shocking events of the Sydney double murder. And how are the victims' families dealing with the sudden acquittal? All in this edition of Get Real. On the 19th of September, after spending 8 years in jail for a crime he was suddenly acquitted of, Ram Tiwary slipped quietly back into Singapore. Ram Tiwary was jailed for killing his two Singaporean housemates in 2003.
Hello?
Attempts to get in touch with Ram and his family went unanswered. The Tiwary family had spent the last 8 years trying to prove the innocence of 33-year-old Ram. His acquittal may have meant closure for the Tiwary family. But for the family of Tony Tan, one of the victims, the sudden acquittal of the man who was supposedly the murderer has torn open old wounds.
Then 意思是说我哥哥是该死还是白白上死的啦。
In 2003, 27-year-old Tony Tan Po Chuan and his housemate Tay Chow Liang were found murdered in their Sydney flat. It was a crime described as brutal and savage. Ram Tiwary, their housemate, and the only one at home at the time, was found guilty and given the life sentence. A sentence that was overturned in July this year.
你凭什么去上诉？很像在挖，在让他们再想回以前发生什么事情。
8年有，又砍命有，又9年有，一直跟他讲怎么办，输了怎么办？没有钱跟他打官司怎么办？啊，不可以哭的嘞。 不可以哭的，他神偏偏叫我不可以哭的。他讲你哭哦，我才很难过。
How could a man twice convicted of murder be found not guilty after all these years? The acquittal of Ram Tiwary has left many wondering. If he wasn't the culprit, then who is? Just what happened that spring day in 2003? In September 2003, 3 Singaporeans lived in this house. It was in a neighborhood shared by other students who went to the University of New South Wales. Tony Tan Po Chuan, Tay Chow Liang, and Ram Tiwary were then in their mid-20s, young men with bright futures. Ram Tiwary was a mechanical engineering student on scholarship from the Singapore Armed Forces. He wasn't a strong student, preferring to spend time in bars and parties rather than books. But he was popular amongst those who knew him. Tony Tan was also an armed forces scholar. He was an outstanding student with a promising military career and had just gotten married earlier that year.
他每次打电话来哦，一定要问我要不要钱，他一定要帮忙我的，他很孝顺的，很帮忙人家的，他也有帮忙他的朋友的。
Tay Chao Liang also had a young wife waiting for him back home. He was in the final year of his engineering degree and was impressing professors with his project on the workings of the brain. Quiet and studious, Tay and Tan were just months shy of graduating and looking forward to going home. But all this came to an abrupt and bloody end one Monday afternoon.
我去买一个报纸，我看读，他讲巴格鲁 murder， 我就想，哎，我儿子住那边吗？
Get Real managed to secure access to photographs of the crime scene. They revealed a gruesome discovery. Tony Tan and Tay Chao Liang were found viciously bludgeoned to death, their skulls bashed in with a baseball bat.
他们来我们的家，一直哭一直问他什么事，我还不知道什么事。他讲我穿把手围，他哈，真的吗？不要吓我了，哇，那个我就麻痹了，那个手就很乱了，麻痹了，不相信吗？
The only other person in the house that day was their flatmate, Ram Tiwary.
I need the ambulance and the police. There's been a murder. My two friends are lying dead outside. There's blood all over the place.
What I want to know is exactly what has happened there.
I have no idea. I was asleep and I heard this screaming, and when I tell my two friends are dead.
On the 15th of September 2003, the local emergency hotline got a call from 109 Barker Street. The time was 2:20 p.m. For 10 minutes and 27 seconds, Ram Tiwary described the gruesome scene in his living room.
When you say they're dead, are they definitely unconscious?
There's blood all over. I can't even tell now.
Okay, does it look like they've been shot? Have they been stabbed?
No, there's a baseball bat and a knife there.
And a knife?
Yes, there's a knife lying on the ground as well.
Albert Leisha, the trio's landlord, lived downstairs. That fateful day, he was at home having lunch. He says he heard nothing unusual.
رحت أنا غسلت دي وجيت قعدت على الطاولة هون أول ما قمت حطيتها بتمي ما شفت إلا زلمة وقوم مثل الحصان.
That someone Albert saw was Ram Tiwary. Albert jumps up from the table and heads to the door. He sees a policeman who tells him there's been a murder. As investigations continued, Tiwary was fingered as the prime suspect. He had given conflicting accounts to police and friends about where he was that afternoon. That only cast doubt over his innocence. At the first trial in 2006 and the retrial in 2009, these inconsistencies were taken by the jury as a sign of Tiwary's guilt. Money was said to be the motive. Weeks before the murder, the mood in the second-floor flat was tense. A handwritten note found in Tiwary's bedroom showed he owed Tay Chao Liang over 5,000 Australian dollars for rent. Tiwary was broke and deep in debt.
It's not that big an amount of money, and Ram's parents are not, they're reasonably well off. They're not overly wealthy, but they're reasonably well off. Surely I couldn't imagine $5,000 being a reason for such a brutal killings.
If money was not a motive for the murder, then what was? New evidence found added to the mystery. What eventually led to Ram Tiwary's acquittal? Get Real returns after the break.
I was asleep and I heard this screaming, and when I tell my two friends are dead.
Is it safe for you to go back outside and just check if they are breathing?
I'm not going back outside till somebody gets here. I'm not going back outside.
No way.
You want to break down the door, go ahead. I'm not going back outside.
This is the emergency call made by Ram Tiwary on September the 15th. He woke up from a nap and discovered that his two housemates were brutally killed in the living room. As the phone recording played out in court, the intense fear and hysteria in his voice was unmistakable.
Are you going to hang up or are you going to stay on?
Do you want me to stay on with you?
Could you please till somebody gets here, please?
Are you worried that somebody is still there?
I closed the door, so I know. Oh, I'm just in one of the other rooms. I don't know, but I've got the bat with me, but there's nothing else. I just pushed mine.
Explaining their decision to acquit Tiwary, judges said his tone was inconsistent with someone who had planned and carried out the execution of Tay Chao Liang and Tony Tan, his two housemates. The judges say the call showed that Tiwary knew who the murderers were and was afraid they would turn on him. And there were more reasons to doubt his guilt. This house, 109 Barker Street, was the scene of that horrific crime 9 years ago. Ram Tiwary was sentenced to life in jail for having battered his two housemates to death here.
Now, we're not allowed inside the flat because the landlord doesn't want the current tenants to know just what happened here in 2003. Now, Tony Tan's body was found slumped just behind this front door, and in fact, when police arrived, they had to push the body slightly just so they could get inside.
This is what the police found in the four-bedroom flat that the three shared. Tony Tan's skull was shattered, the scalp torn off, exposing parts of his brain. A weapon, a kitchen knife, lay under his right leg. Following the trail of blood up the hall, officers found Tony Tan's spectacles and broken teeth, where he was first attacked. Lying behind a nearby couch was Tay Chao Liang. He had been assaulted shortly after midday.
The skull, as you can see, this is a real skull. It's very, very thick. So if it gets shattered underneath it, the brain will just ooze out like bits of bean curd, together with a lot of blood.
Besides the severe head injuries, Tay Chao Liang and Tony Tan also had deep stab wounds in their necks. Now, in the case of Tony Tan, the knife had gone in so deep it punctured his voice box. And so you can imagine the amount of blood that was spilled as the two men lay bleeding from their wounds. And in fact, blood was everywhere when police arrived at the scene, soaking the carpets and smeared on the walls.
The amount of blood spilt by the victims was used as proof by Tiwary's defense lawyers. Because while there was blood splattered everywhere, all that was found on Tiwary were just a few spots on his clothes, his hands, his ankles and feet.
If someone's been struck with an item like a baseball bat and that bat gets blood on it, then when the bat's being swung back, you get cast-off blood. And that would include blood going onto the back of the person who's holding the bat. There's blood on the walls and all around, but not on Ram's back.
What was also unexplained? Why was only Tony Tan's blood on the baseball bat and knife? Was there a second murder weapon? The bat that was found belonged to Tiwary, but weeks before, Tony had also bought a bat, telling friends he wanted one for protection. But Tony's bat was missing. This, plus the fact that there was no sign of forced entry, suggested that there were others at the scene. Others who took the bat with them. People who the victims might have known.
There was 3 people in a unit, 2 died, 1 was alive, and that can be suspicious. But suspicious doesn't mean someone's guilty.
A tantalizing clue lay in the seemingly strange behavior of Tay Chao Liang and Tony Tan the day they were killed. Tay Chao Liang never missed a lecture, but at the midday class, he was nowhere to be seen. Tony Tan turns up, but is unusually late. Friends said he looked uneasy and preoccupied. Later, he abruptly tells a classmate he and Tay have to cancel a meeting. It seems both men were expecting someone that afternoon of September the 15th. But who?
Now that was not all. Tony Tan was last seen at this staircase leading out towards Barker Street. Classmates had seen him getting into a light-coloured car parked just across the road from the university. Now some said there were about 3 Asians in the car, others said there were 2. This was just after the lecture at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Barely half an hour later, Tony Tan was found dead. The car and the occupants were never found.
But Tony Tan's family refuses to believe he would take a ride from strangers.
我在想 ，What does the 白色车 do with this case？ 所以你们一直讲白色车吧，不懂有没有那个车主有没有 step up？ 所以一直环绕哥哥跟白色车，所以我觉得是荒谬吧。
In any case, investigations into the mystery men lead nowhere.
The police don't seem, well, in terms of the judgment, there don't seem to have been many inquiries made in relation to that vehicle. But certainly in many cases before, they get who they think may have done it, and then consciously or even subconsciously, exculpatory evidence is excluded or ignored. And unfortunately, that can result in miscarriages of justice.
Despite these unexplained mysteries, juries in 2 separate trials felt there were sufficient grounds to pronounce Ram Tiwary guilty. Ram Tiwary is sentenced to 48 years in prison for a crime he insists he did not commit. And then, one day in July,
a Singaporean student who was twice convicted of murdering his flatmates in Sydney has been cleared by an appeals court.
After the break, we find out how the families of the victims are coping with the acquittal.
只是我们不甘愿嘛，不甘愿一定要报仇，一定要讲，一定要讲。
The murder of 2 Singaporean students in Sydney 2003 seems to be a case people here want to forget. Former lecturers, friends, witnesses, and even the Sydney police refused to speak when approached by Get Real. But Albert Leisha, the boys' landlord and owner of the house where the crime took place, can't shake off the memory.
كانوا كتير ويدم الشباب وكانوا ضل ينزلوا عند الهان ويصلونا ونلعب نحن بيهم وياكلوا معنا وناكل معهم يعملوا الاكل فوق ينزلوها لهاني تنقعدنا على برا على البراندا ناكل نحن بيهم يدلوا هني وابني يلعبوا ابني يصيروا ابني يعملوا له كل شيء بدهم اياه وأنا زعلان لأنه ما قدرت ما كنت ماني عرف بشيء تساعدهم ما حدا نعرف بشيء ما حنعرف بشيء تساعدنا بنوب إلا بس اسمع صوت فوق بس اسمع تحلت فوق تقول هونيك اللي عند السوم بولو باكد مين في فوق ايش في فوق
我上跟我讲，他要搬去 take over 了，他的朋友。我讲不要啦，你这边很好，你要搬出去那边么？他讲那边靠近吗？靠近学校吗？住2个月还是住多少？住拜拜了。
Ram Tiwary, who shared the house with the 2 murdered victims, was home at the time of the murder. He was seen as the culprit and put into jail. But in July this year, the Supreme Court in Sydney acquitted him, saying there was simply not enough evidence to prove his guilt. Tony Tan's parents used to pray for their son's safety every day when he was studying in Sydney. Now, they can only pray that his real killer will be found.
我常常不要报仇的，说心情啊很好，只是我们不甘愿嘛，不甘愿一定要报仇，一定要讲，一定要讲。看天啊，天天有命啊，冤枉了，我儿子是冤枉的。他跟曹亮啊就不要讲了，我儿子是冤枉的。
Reminders of Tony's life in Sydney are still kept in the police envelope that they were returned in.
还有笔哦，还有手表，笔和手表在哪？这是他的手表啊，对。所以戴的时候你感觉怎么样？
觉得他跟我在想呢。
不敢烧，心痛，不要烧。我的女儿讲不要烧，就没有人这么灵流。我想啊，烧就没有这么灵流。那这么漂亮，这么很深，你看。好像那个被波都打下去啊，心痛，死很惨的，有病啊死啊，别活活给人家打死啊，哇，真的是该割我的心。我每次来，每次都有眼泪的，可以哭，他就不要哭，看天就好了，看天了，你在做，天在看呢。
Till today, no one knows who the real killers are. And the mystery of the two deaths is one that continues to haunt the families of the victims.